Good evening, everyone. The time is 7:45. We're going to start at 8 o'clock. And before then, we're going to chat to everyone around the world who's joining us. So Mark Drummle, turn on your camera and let's unmute you and have a chat.
I'm here, so.
So where in the world do you join us from?
From Virginia, actually, a small town called Lexington, Virginia.
I think we know of Lexington, Virginia fairly well, not far from Washington, D.C.
Yeah, it's a couple of hours south, so not that far. Yeah, it's a bit southwest in the mountains. It's very beautiful here.
Okay, and what do you do in Lexington?
I'm a law professor at Washington and Lee University. I work in the area of international criminal law.
Oh, wow. Amazing. Is it a big university?
No, it's a little one, a little dot of a spot. Like the law school has about 400 students. So, and there's another university around that has a little bit more. But I've actually spoken at the censor. I know Tali. So years ago, I was in Joburg and gave a presentation. So.
Oh, well, we need to have you back as soon as
I'd love to.
So of course, important for us to know, have you been vaccinated?
Yes, I have for a month already.
Both doses.
Fully vaccinated, so.
Okay.
So I'm ready to Zoom with impunity now. Right?
You can you could maybe even see humans in person now.
Yeah, I'm teaching and we're teaching in person here, and everything is open. So.
We've
got social distancing requirements, but my class lectures are all in person in the classroom. So
we long for those days on this side of the world. So Mark with the C, Mark Guamako, hi, you joining us from Kigali?
Yeah, yes, I am.
So tell us about Corona north of South Africa. What are things like in Rwanda Corona-wise?
We are much better than you guys.
That I have no doubt. Tell us how much better you're doing than us.
So we've only had, totally, 21,000 cases in total for the past, since last year till now. And at the moment we have, I think, somewhere around 1,000 active cases only. And the numbers have decreased significantly to somewhere around 70 per day. And they're testing somewhere around 4,000 to 5,000 people every day. So yeah, that's where we are. And vaccinations, we didn't get many vaccinations. We only had over 340.
Okay, you've done better than us. We're only on about 240,000 for 57 million of us.
Wow, it's too little. It's a drop in the ocean. Even as we only had 340, we vaccinated people within 6 days. So after 6 days, the 340,000 were all vaccinated. So the numbers are lower, and we know that our capacities are not that high medically. So we also are very cautious on what we do. So I mostly work from home. My wife also works from home. Different businesses have resumed, but where necessary, we stay at home and we don't mingle outside.
And if we were to walk on the streets of Kigali, would people be wearing masks and observing social distancing?
Yes. Not only on the streets, even in some homes.
Oh, well, that's incredible. Tali Nates, you've been to Rwanda on a number of occasions, haven't you?
My second passport is Rwandan. I'm visiting Rwanda for the past 20 years. So yeah, I miss it. The last time I visited was Mark, I was with you and left, I think, in the end of February 2020. And Howard, I saw people on the plane with masks and I thought, why are they doing it? This is so strange. And not knowing that a few weeks later, reality will hit. So, yeah.
So, Tali, how many times do you think you've been to Rwanda?
Many times I go more than twice a year. So maybe hard to know, but I assume 40 times or 30 times.
Oh, okay. That's a lot. Mark Drumble, you must travel a lot around the world relating to the sort of work that you've done. So where around the world have you worked?
Many different places. I mean, now, of course, the travel's a little bit less, although I'm still traveling. We actually lived in Belfast in Northern Ireland in the fall for a sabbatical, and I've done a couple of overseas trips in the past little while. So work in the Balkans is one spot in which I've had an opportunity to spend some time. I have also been to Rwanda, not 40 times, a long time ago. And that's when I was there for quite a while. I was doing legal work in Kigali, actually, following the genocide against the Tutsi. And other than that, I think my interests in international criminal law and post-conflict reconstruction are not necessarily specialized in any one particular area. They're both institutionally driven. I'm quite interested in the work of the International Criminal Courts, but also universal. I'm very interested in exploring the limits of law as a method of, in particular, criminal law, post-conflict reconstruction. And I'm also very keen on bringing the local back into the conversation and to resist some of the universal push that international criminal law through international institutions might exert. So that brings me to a lot of these conversations, maybe a bit of an eclectic space. I'm also very interested in the role, the tragic role of ordinary people, certainly ordinary before conflict begins, the role of ordinary people in extraordinary violence. I think that's one of the trickiest questions to unpack.
So Mark, one of the things, Tali knows, one of my very good friends for the last 30 years is someone called Ken Kane, who wrote the book Emergency Sex and Other Desperate Measures. And when you read the part of his book on what happened in Rwanda and the anger that he exhibits towards things like the United Nations, and when he speaks about almost the betrayal by the United Nations of the people of Rwanda, like, do you get that same sense, say, in the work that you do, that the international institutions set up to protect people have really failed people around the world?
Mark me or Mark K or Mark C?
Well, let's ask both Marks.
I'm happy, Mark, that you're with the C and not with the K. Although I grew up in Montreal, Canada, so I've spent a lot of time being called Mark C as well. So it's one might write in French. No, but Howard, yes, of course, to get to your question, I do think at times the role of international actors can be cringeworthy in allowing atrocity to metastasize. And actually, to be frank, one of my critiques I think I would make of individual criminal responsibility, particularly for very senior leaders of violence, and that should be the case. There should be international criminal responsibility for that. But sometimes I find that focusing inordinately or too much on that can deflect attention away from the multi-causal reasons why atrocity may happen. And certainly in the case of Rwanda, it's almost impossible to deny that the indifference, nonchalance, disengagement of United Nations actors contributed, as well as in many ways the colonial footprint, and in particular the role, I would think it's fair to say, of France in the process. So yeah, I think there's a deflection when we talk about a handful of individuals at the highest level. You're really pulling our gaze away from many of the structural factors, and I don't think Rwanda is a unique example of that. I mean, look at Srebrenica in Bosnia, but go back to the abandonment of European Jews by the international community in the lead up to the full operationalization of the Nuremberg laws and Kristallnacht leading up to the final solution. It's the same dynamic.
Okay, That's great. So Ephraim Zurof's having some difficulty joining us. Tali, I've resent him the link and I've WhatsApped him his link. If not, he will join and you'll have your name associated with it. So you may appear on the screen twice. And before we chat more to Tali and both Marks, welcome back to everyone. It's wonderful to see such an amazing response. We've had over 2,000 people already registering this evening. So it's wonderful to have so many people, and we really want to know where in the world that you are. We haven't done one of these since before Pesach, so it feels like it's been forever, but it's probably been about 10 days. And Ephraim Zurof, welcome. I'm going to see if I can change your name at the moment.
Yes.
Okay.
Don't change it. That's my name.
That's your okay. Now you're on as your own name, not as Talinate. Welcome. I don't know if you know the other people with you on the panel. We've called them all Mark just to make it easier for you, but we've spelt it a little different. But while we're doing that, we want to say hello to Jeff, who says he's in the freezing London, United Kingdom. Barbara's in Los Angeles. I see we've got people in Buckinghamshire. We've got Joan in Buckinghamshire. Ilan is in Israel. We've got, if I can get my thing to work over here, people in Michigan in the USA. It must be freezing there, I imagine. People in Modi'in in Israel, Cape Town. The people are telling us around the world where they're coming in from. So it's amazing to have such a fantastic audience. So Ephraim, before we joined us, we're actually just checking in on how COVID was around the world. We've checked in on how things are in the United States, and Mark Drumble is vaccinated. Mark Wakama isn't vaccinated yet because they've only done. Oh, you have been vaccinated.
Yes, I've been vaccinated.
But there are almost no cases in Rwanda at the moment. You're in Israel. Where in Israel do you join us from? From Jerusalem.
From Jerusalem.
And can we presume you've been double vaccinated and life has returned to normal on your side of the world?
What's COVID?
If you want an answer to that question, we'll probably have about 4,000 or 5,000 people watching in South Africa tonight who will tell you exactly what COVID is and how it's still affecting their lives.
Make Aliyah and get vaccinated.
I don't think you'll have us at the moment because you're not letting people into your country who haven't been vaccinated yet.
And especially South Africans, sadly, with our lovely variant.
So in fact, we're doing a webinar tomorrow night, and we're calling it South Africans Vaccine Rollout, and it's details like where would you register, how would you get your vaccine, what should you know about a very tachlis, detailed explanation of our vaccine program. And we're also going to be speaking to one of the heads of the Maccabi Medical Aid in Israel to find out the lessons of what they learned, what worked and what didn't work. And in our preparation,
that's my health plan.
Okay, in our preparation,
I'm curious what's going on in Rwanda.
Yeah, we'll tell you in a second, but I can tell you the guy from Maccabi said to us, Israel during the vaccine program had the British strain. And we said, what do you mean?
Right.
No. I said, what do you mean the British strain? He said, strangely enough, Israelis who've never stood in lines in their lives, who've always tried to push each other out, suddenly became British for just the vaccine process. And everything was very orderly and everyone waited their turn. He says in Maccabi, they refer to that as the British strain. They don't know how it happened for the first time.
And they're all hoping it'll continue.
So Mark, just getting back to you, we're going to start in about another minute. You've obviously got an association with the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. That's how you know Tali. Is there much interest around the world in what happened in Rwanda 27 years ago today?
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry.
No.
You can go on.
Mark Wamaka. Let's go. Okay, Mark Wamaka. Let's.
I think the genocide against the Tutsi serves as a lesson to what the world can do to restore broken nations. but also what the world refused to do, even when they had information and in the new era of the media age. So we've said our connection with Tali. We've been going to different countries and training using the Holocaust, using the genocide against the Tutsi, also using the apartheid in different countries where we're training from. And the organization that I work for, Aegis Trust, that works in Rwanda, Central African Republic, Kenya, South Sudan, the United States, and also the UK. So we've also been going to different places training. And we have a program called the Peace and Values Education that has been integrated into the Rwandan education curriculum to make sure that people who are part of it probably will speak about it. But to make sure that we take this and train in different parts of the world. But as you know, it's difficult with the age of the deniers, trying to make sure that they shut us down, trying to make sure that they trample on the lives that were lost, trying to, all those different things. So yes, there is interest, but of course it comes with a pinch of what people know that is not the actual story, but the story that they have heard, and mostly from the deniers.
So my one question just before we begin is, Tali educates me on the right nomenclature. And,
yes.
And there's some language that's acceptable and some language that is not acceptable. She educates me on. You refer to the genocide against the Tutsis. What is
yes.
the correct way to refer to this? I understand the Rwandan genocide is not an acceptable term.
Yes, we all here on the panel understand, and Mark will tell us legally, and the UN description. It talks about that the genocide is an act perpetrated against a certain group of people to eliminate them in part or totally. So it would be very difficult to say it's the genocide against Rwandans or the genocide in Rwanda, when actually the intention was not to exterminate all Rwandans. So the intention was to eliminate all Tutsis. So it was never, the intention was never to exterminate all Rwandans. As a matter of fact, when the genocide was happening, do you know that there were some people who are getting married? Do you know that there are people who are going to the market as usual? Because that was not them being targeted, it was a certain group of people. So it's not just that being accepted, it's the right thing to say because they were the people who are being targeted. So that's the right way to term it. And I hope that explanation will help even all the people who are on the call on this link to understand that it's the genocide against the Tutsi because they were targeted and they were the ones to be eliminated, not all Rwandans.
Great explanation. Thank you. With that, I'm going to ask all our panelists to turn off their cameras. We'll call you back one by one. And the time has just gone 2 minutes past 8. A huge welcome back to all of our viewers around the world. It's amazing when we ask people where they are to see what a remarkable audience we have in places like Canada, United States, and South and Central America, throughout Europe, in the United Kingdom, in Israel. We're not so big in Australia because of the time difference, but tonight we literally have thousands and thousands of people who are going to be watching us. The interest in tonight's topic, talking about bringing Nazi war criminals to justice and other genocidal killers to justice, has really touched the nerve of so many people. So we want to welcome you all this evening and to say we haven't been broadcasting our webinars for about 8 or 9 days because of Passover, but it's so nice to see you all again and to welcome you back to the South African Jewish Reports webinar series. Tonight is in fact webinar number 85 since lockdown began, and on controls this evening is Danny Kedar. Danny, if you could turn on your camera, let's wave at everyone. Hi, Danny. Nice to see you again.
Howard, great to be back, everyone. Welcome back all to our audience. Lovely to see everyone.
I presume you're counting the Omer, which is explaining that beard?
It's only day 11, Howard.
Day number 11. Okay, is it itchy, Danny?
It's, yeah, beard oil. That's my suggestion.
Thanks so much. So everyone, Danny, there's a new edition of the Jewish Report. It just went online a few minutes ago. Let us call up so people can see what's headline news this week in the Jewish Report. And it is this tragic story of the shooting in Melrose Arch, which is about 700 meters away from our home. And this young Jewish kid who is in hospital at the moment, having his jaw and face reconstructed after a shootout at a jewelry store in Melrose Arch. Please go pick up your copy of the Jewish Report. You know, we distribute throughout South Africa in about 240 different locations throughout South Africa, free of charge. You'll find us at every shul and every kosher shop, and in Spar and Checkers and Pick and Pay, and in your garage shop, in CNA, in exclusive books. Please go pick up your copy of the Jewish Report. In addition to that, don't forget we're online, so you can go on even now and download the entire edition of the Jewish Report, or alternatively, look at the individual articles, and you'll find us on www.sajr.co.za. Really an absolute worthwhile read. And very quickly, tomorrow night's webinar, which we're doing at 8 o'clock tomorrow, details the South African vaccine rollout and lessons from Israel's vaccine program. So if you haven't registered yet, Danny's going to stick into the chat where you can go register. We also have sent out our first advert for this, but it's going to be a nitty-gritty thing. Where must you register? Where must you go? How are you going to get the vaccine? Are you likely to be vaccinated in April or May or June? We're going to go through in great details. And on that panel, we've got Stavros Nikolai from Business for South Africa. We've got Dr. Ron Whelan from Discovery Health. And we've got Professor Barry Shub, who I'm sure everyone knows is head of the Ministerial Advisory Committee on COVID vaccines. So they'll be on tomorrow, and we'll also be joined by someone from the Maccabi Medical Aid in Israel, who's going to tell us about the success of the vaccine program. What are they seeing in terms of infections? Do these vaccinations actually work? Is the inoculation actually keeping people out of hospital and out of serious illness? And what are the lessons that they learned? What works and what doesn't work? What incentivizes people and doesn't incentivize people? So that's all tomorrow night, 8 o'clock. So if you haven't registered yet, we'll send out another reminder tomorrow morning as well. But please join us tomorrow. It really would be fantastic to see you tomorrow evening as well. It's going to really be practical, useful information relating to the vaccine. And if you're watching us on Facebook or YouTube tonight, please click the like and subscribe button. That just allows us to communicate with you more easily and notify you when we go live and when we're having webinars as well. So please, if you're on YouTube or Facebook or even on Zoom, click the like and subscribe button, and let's make sure that we actually stay in contact. And with that, I would love Tali Nates to turn on her camera. Tali, it's so wonderful to host another one of these webinars together with the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. This is your day-to-day nitty-gritty work, educating people about genocide, about the depth of humanity, and teaching people that this isn't part of our history. This could be part of our present if we're not actually really careful.
Absolutely. It is an absolute pleasure to work with the Jewish Report again, and with you, Howard. And good evening, good morning, good afternoon to all those that are joining us from all around the world. Today is a Memorial Day. Today is a Memorial Day, of course, of what we call Kwibuka 27, remembering the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. Today is when the genocide started, and for the next 100 days, we will remember that genocide that happened only 3.5 hours flight away from us here in Johannesburg 27 years ago. But also tonight is the beginning of Yom HaShoah, Howard. So in Israel and all around the world, Holocaust Remembrance Day starts tonight and will continue tomorrow. So joining today to learn together and to reflect on the histories together, I think is really, really important for all of us.
So, of course, let's remind people as well that on Friday at 12 o'clock, the South African Jewish Board of Deputies will be having our communal commemoration of Yom HaShoah. If you haven't registered for that, please won't you diarize 12 o'clock on Friday, participate, join on the South African Jewish Board of Deputies YouTube channel or their Facebook page, and join us as a community as we pay homage to the 6 million Jews who were murdered during the Holocaust. And that's on Friday. But Tali, this is close to home. After the Second World War, everyone said never again. And
Absolutely.
then we had things like Cambodia, and then we had Rwanda. So it's something we live with.
Yeah, and the thing that is really tragic is that April, in a way, is coined as Genocide Awareness Month, because so many genocides started in April or are commemorated in April. So, of course, we spoke about the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. We spoke about Holocaust Remembrance Day that is always marked on the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising that started on the 19th of April, but it is according to the Hebrew calendar and is observed. But it's also Armenia is commemorated this month on the 24th of April. And many other genocides. As you said, after the Holocaust, the world said never again. But it was never again until the next time, as we know, because genocides happened in Cambodia in the 70s, in Rwanda in the 90s, in the former Yugoslavia, and of course it did not end in the 20th century. Sadly, we see events unfolding around the world that are of great concern to all of us, from Myanmar to Darfur in the beginning of the 2000s, and nowadays China, Uyghurs situation is worrying. So
tell you one of the things that I don't understand, and I want to almost compare. Many of us watching have our ancestry in Lithuania, and very similar to the genocide against the Tutsis in Rwanda. People were killed by their next door neighbors. The story of Lithuanian Jews, just like the story of the Tutsis in Rwanda, is people were murdered by their next door neighbors, next to whom they had lived for hundreds of years. And these people weren't mass murderers before, and they weren't mass murderers after. But for that period of time, they became mass murderers and killers of people that they actually knew and lived with. How is that possible?
Yeah, it's in all the genocides. Many times, neighbors killed neighbors, family members killed family members, and we saw that during the Holocaust, specifically in Eastern Europe. And we have experts today with us that will talk a little bit more about that. But we certainly saw that in Rwanda, and the tragic reality is that. Of course, many of them were what we call ordinary people. They were not monsters. They did not have horns. They did not, they did not look differently than you and me. But the circumstances and context, brainstorming, a buildup of hatred, of othering, to such an extent, if it's racism, if it's anti-Semitism, if it's anti-Tutsi sentiments, if it's anti-Christian sentiments in the Armenian case, and so on, created a situation where ordinary men and women turned against their neighbors. Most of them were not sadistic beasts. Most of them were ordinary men and women. They became murderers, most of them mass murderers, but when the genocide ended, most of them never killed again. And there are many, many stories that our experts will share with us today. And also the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center is going to host in May one of the experts, Professor Holly Nibet-Brem, that did a research about Rwanda, actually going and finding out exactly who were the killers before and what happened to them when they were released from jail. Did they get integrated into the community, and did they ever committed crime again? So I hope that our audience today are in our mailing list of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, and please join us to explore those issues a little bit more. Howard, just a little story, you know, in one of my many visits in Rwanda, I think it was in 2004, I was in a Unity and Reconciliation circle where perpetrators, killers were released from jail after serving 10 years in jail. And the Unity and Reconciliation process was to bring members of the community, of the village, to sit together. Perpetrators sat with, you know, victims' families, together with wives of perpetrators. And I had the opportunity to speak to some of those perpetrators and ask them exactly that question that you asked me. And I will never forget that one of them told me a chilling sentence. He said to me, you know, the elders told me I was young, I was afraid. He gave lots of excuses or justification. But then he said to me a chilling sentence, and he said, you know, the first one was difficult. After that, it was not. And I'll never forget that.
And Tali, tonight we're talking about justice. But part of justice is to bring justice to the victims by actually prosecuting the perpetrators. But another element of justice is, in fact, education. When you think about how the Turks have tried to cover up the Armenian genocide, when you think about the fact that they're Holocaust deniers and deniers of the genocide against the Tutsis, when you look at that, part of the justice process is an educational one, so you can use trials and other things that happen as didactic tools to try educate people about what happened and to try shut down this denialism that we've seen taking place over the last 100 years of perpetrators never facing up to what they've actually done.
You know, denial is part of genocide, really, and denial of any of the genocides that we spoke about today exists. There is denial of the genocide, of course, of the Holocaust. There is denial of Armenia. There is denial of the genocide in Rwanda. There is denial of many other genocides, and education is key. Education is something that all our panelists are involved with. We have amazing.
So tell us
tell
us about our panelists tonight.
Absolutely. So we have an amazing lineup of, I must say, friends of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, and now friends of the South African Jewish Report. So I'm so happy to have with us Dr. Ephraim Zurov, of course, the very, very well-known Nazi hunter that South Africans know so well. He visited South Africa, he spoke for us at the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, and he's a great writer and speaker, and really a voice for justice and a voice for learning about the injustices of the past. Then we have joining us from Kigali, Rwanda, Mark Gacaca. And Mark Gacaca is a personal great friend. We worked together for many, many years. We traveled to Nigeria and to many other countries in Africa. And Mark is working at the Kigali Genocide Memorial. Mark is also working at Aegis Trust. He is a specialist of educating the youth about the dangers of the past, but also peace education and fighting against extremism wherever that is rearing its ugly head. We also have with us Dr. Tamir Hod. And Tamir is an expert on the John Ivan Demjanjuk, or the Demjanjuk trials, the multiple trials in Israel, the appeal, and then the trial in Germany.
And that's the story people would know from the Netflix series, The Devil Next Door.
Absolutely, and it was such an honor to learn more from Tamir, that really investigated this for so many years and wrote his PhD and his book about it, and he's also an educator. He teaches at the Ghetto Fighters House. He teaches in many, many academies in Israel. And then last but not least, our very good friend, Professor Mark Drumble, all the way from the US, from DC area, and but traveling all around the world. I met Mark when he spoke for us at the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center many years ago. But Mark, I think we saw each other last in Cambodia in July of 2019 in one of those genocide education conferences. A great educator. Can't wait to learn from Mark, not only about Rwanda, which he worked in as a lawyer, but also about his fascinating research on the Capo trials in Israel, and also his recent research about aging perpetrators on trial, the over 90 years old that we see on our screens that are standing on trial now in Germany.
So Tali, before we speak to Ephraim, let us turn off our cameras and let's watch a very short video just to put into perspective exactly what we're going to be talking to Ephraim about tonight.
I was in command at Auschwitz until December 1st, 1943, and estimate that at least 2.5 million victims were exterminated there by gassing and burning. At least another 500,000 died due to starvation and disease, making a total of about 3 million dead. These included approximately 20,000 Soviet prisoners of war. The rest of the victims were approximately 100,000 German Jews, and a great many citizens, mostly Jews, from Holland, France, Belgium, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Greece, and other countries.
It's 1945 and World War II is over. Adolf Hitler is dead. So are his top lieutenants, Heinrich Himmler and Joseph Goebbels. But dozens of high-level Nazis are still alive and in prison. What do the Allied powers do with them? They take them to court in their own backyard. The Nuremberg trials were a series of international prosecutions that decided the fates of Nazi war criminals. The trials were administered by the 4 principal nations of the Allied powers, 4 judges, 1 from each Allied country. The London Charter also defined the 3 major charges each criminal would face. Crimes against peace, like planning and starting a war crimes, such as killing POWs, and crimes against humanity, in other words, killing civilians, as the Nazis did during the Holocaust. The trials lasted at Nuremberg from 1945 to 1949, but the highest profile cases were brought to court between 1945 and 1946. This period was known as the trial of the major war criminals. Among the 22 Nazi leaders on trial at Nuremberg were Gestapo founder Hermann Göring, Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess, Nazi Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, and the German architect Albert Speer.
Wilhelm Göring, on the counts of the indictment on which you have been convicted, the tribunal sentences you to death by hanging. Joachim von Ribbentrop, death by hanging. Fritz Saukel, death by hanging. Julius Streicher, death by hanging. Wilhelm Frick, death by hanging. Hans Frank, death by hanging. Alfred Rosenberg, death by hanging. Wilhelm Keitel, death by hanging. Ernst
The testimony that convicted Adolf Eichmann of Holocaust atrocities more than half a century ago has lost none of its power to chill the heart.
Count, nature of offense, crime against the Jewish people.
April 1961, 16 years after the end of World War II. A Nazi colonel named Adolf Eichmann stood trial in Israel for his part in the Holocaust.
During the period 1939 to 1945, caused the killing of millions of Jews.
A master planner of what the Nazis called the final solution, their plan to eradicate Europe's Jews. At the end of the war, Eichmann was in U.S. custody, but the troops didn't know who they had. He escaped, making his way to Italy, then Argentina, setting up home in a poor neighborhood and living under an assumed name.
Ricardo Clement, and he entered to Argentina in 1950 with this name, Ricardo Clement. And at the end, he found a position as the head of the department in Mercedes.
He worked for Mercedes-Benz.
Yes.
Capturing Eichmann was the job of 11 Mossad agents, Israel's version of the CIA, who snatched him off the streets of Buenos Aires in May of 1960 and transported him to Israel to meet justice.
He came in contact, but I had to obey orders. I had to do it.
But for the first time, survivors of the death camps had the chance to testify about the horrors they had endured.
Eichmann is found guilty of crimes against the Jewish people, crimes against humanity, and war crimes.
Adolf Eichmann would be convicted and hanged.
Imagine a world where justice never expires. Today, former SS guard Oskar Gröning, known as the accountant of Auschwitz, was put on trial for being an accessory to 300,000 counts of murder. The 93-year-old entered court on his walker. It was a bittersweet victory, though, for his victims as he turned to the bench and accepted his role in the Holocaust, saying, "It is without question that I am morally complicit in the murder of millions of Jews through my activities at Auschwitz. Before the victims, I also admit to this moral guilt here with regret and humility. To the question as to whether I am criminally culpable, that is for you to decide," unquote.
A former Auschwitz guard on trial in Germany has apologized in court to victims. He told them he regretted being part of a criminal organization that had killed so many people. He's charged with being an accessory to the murder of at least 170,000 people. Germany is holding what is likely to be the last trials linked to the Holocaust, in which more than 6 million people, mostly Jews, were killed by the Nazis.
Howard? While I'm, oh.
Sorry. Talia, while my camera turns on, I was just saying, after the Second World War, what happened to the Nazis?
So most Nazis were never brought to trial. That is the reality. Some were, and we will hear about some of them as we speak to Ephraim. We heard from the movie that you put together about the main Nuremberg trial, where 22 of the top Nazis were brought to justice. But of course, there were many other Nuremberg trials, like the doctor's trial, the Einsatzgruppen trial. Of course, Ben Ferenc, the prosecutor of the Einsatzgruppen trial, is still alive. He's 101 years old. I think he just turned 102 years old, and he's still alive. He was a young 26-year-old when he prosecuted the Einsatzgruppen in Nuremberg. There were many other trials that are less known. They were held by the Allies. Maybe people know of the execution or the trial of Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, and he's hanging, or he's hanging actually in the grounds of Auschwitz I by the Polish government. And maybe people are aware of the Belsen trials, where in 1945, in the end of 1945, the British military, there was a British military trial where the Bergen-Belsen perpetrators were put on trial. And I think that is quite famous because of Joseph Kramer, the commandant that was executed. And I think why it is quite famous is because of Irma Grese, the guy that was in Auschwitz and also in Bergen-Belsen, was 22 years old, was nicknamed the hyena of Auschwitz, was very, very cruel to prisoners, and she was also hanged. So there were trials. You spoke about Eichmann.
In fact, Tali, your uncle gave evidence at one of the war crimes, did he not?
Absolutely. So there are many, many trials, and thank you for asking about it, because it's something that I usually don't talk about. So many of the audiences know that my father and my uncle were survivors. They were saved by Oskar Schindler, but before that, they were in different concentration camps. And my uncle, Henrik Turner, was called to testify in Freiburg, in the Freiburg trial in West Germany in 1965, against two Nazi war criminals that none of you ever heard of. The one was Richard Schemisch, and the other one was Robert Weissmann. Now, who are those SS people? Just very briefly, what were they accused of? They were accused of deportation and mass shootings of Jewish men, women, and children in few places in Novi Targ, Zakopane, and that area in southwestern Poland, mass shooting using forced laborers, and also shootings of thousands and thousands of people in that area. What was the verdict? Schemisch received 4.5 years in prison, and Weissmann received 7 years in prison. I don't have time to explain the German law and the changes in the law, but in those years, the 60s, when the Auschwitz trial happened, and those smaller trials, the verdicts were very, very short, and many times the perpetrators were released after serving half of the term or not. Maybe just to say that my uncle used to say to me, and he actually gave an interview about it after the trial, and he used to say, whatever the verdict will be, it will never, be a just verdict for the victims. That's what he used to say. And he said he wasn't a religious man, but he used to say, only God will actually avenge the blood of the victims. So it's interesting.
So Tali, God may avenge the blood of the victims, but the one man who has dedicated his life to making sure that the victims are represented in a court of law is Ephraim Zuroff. So Ephraim, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's a great honor and privilege to have you with us. Tell us, how did you become a Nazi hunter?
First of all, I can't restrain myself from commenting in response to what Tali said. I disagree with her. The number of Nazis who were prosecuted is quite small, and convicted even much smaller. So I want to give you a figure. Until 1985 in West Germany, there were 200,000 Nazis investigated, 120,000 indictments, in other words, were charged. Less than 7,000 people were tried and convicted. Now, you have to understand something. The scope of the criminality of the Holocaust is so huge, it's almost incomprehensible. Every single country in Europe, with the exception of the 6 neutrals, in other words, Turkey, Switzerland, Spain, Portugal, Sweden, and Ireland, and of course, Britain and Russia who were fighting against the Nazis. Okay, the Nazis controlled that entire landmass. Every single country the Holocaust played out. Every single country had tens of thousands, or at least thousands, or tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of perpetrators. And the number of those Many of them were prosecuted, especially behind the Iron Curtain. And if there's anything good to say about the Soviet Union, and there's very little good to say about the Soviet Union, the one good thing that they did do was take the issue of collaboration with the Nazis seriously and punish tens of thousands of people. Actually, one of the lacuna in Holocaust research today is that we don't know the scope and the number of those prosecutions. But I know from my experience that in every country that was either part of the Soviet Union or under communism, there were thousands and thousands of trials. Okay? Now,
so Ephraim, getting back to your story, we want to know about you. How did you become...
One second. One other thing I must say. I'm not the only person who devoted his life to bringing Nazis to justice. Simon Wiesenthal, he was the person who kept it alive for decades when there was almost no interest in the Holocaust. And people like Tuvia Friedman, who also devoted his life to it, and others. Okay, but I am a person who has devoted most of my life to that cause and continue to do so, because even today there are opportunities to bring Nazi war criminals to justice, which is exactly what we're trying to do.
So how did you start, Ephraim? How did you start the journey?
I started by a unbelievable stroke of luck. I have to say one thing, that, you know, very often people come up to me and tell me that I have their dream job. It's very often grandchildren of survivors. And they say that when they were growing up, they wanted to grow up and be Nazi hunters. Well, my parents are not survivors. They're both born in America. And that was not my dream. As I often say, to the amusement of many people, my dream was to be the first Orthodox Jew to play in the NBA. But to be honest, I wasn't good enough, and you can't really be an Orthodox Jew in the NBA, although now Amari Stoudemire is trying to change that. But in any event, I was working for the US Justice Department in Israel as a researcher, for the Office of Special Investigations, which was established in 1979 to help take legal action against the Nazis who were living in the United States. And there were about approximately 10,000 Nazis who entered the United States posing as innocent refugees. And the Americans, who have done a very good job, relatively, have won cases against 117 out of 10,000. And they considered a successful operation. So you have to understand the numbers. Relatively little has been done, in a certain sense. If you believe that every person who killed a Jew or helped kill Jews deserves to be punished, the percentage of those who have been punished is quite low. Okay, so in any event, in 1985, the Simon Wiesenthal Center found a letter sent by a American intelligence officer to Superior, in which he indicated that he had received information that Josef Mengele had been arrested and released by the American Army near Vienna in late 1946. And the letter was dated January 47. Now, the Attorney General of the United States, William French Smith, at the time made three decisions. The United States will physically look for Josef Mengele. We're talking already 1986. No one knows what has happened to Mengele. He's disappeared, hasn't been caught.
Ephraim, let's just, for those people who are watching who don't know who Josef Mengele is, he is known as the Angel of Death.
Okay, give us he's one of the 23 Nazi doctors who performed the selections on the ramp in Birkenau, deciding who would be sent to be gassed immediately and who would be sent to labor. But he's notorious for this, I emphasize, pseudo-scientific experiments that he ran to try and induce German women to have multiple births instead of one baby at a time. Every set of twins or triplets who came to Auschwitz were sent to Mengele's clinic, even if they were young children who normally would have been sent right to be gassed. That was one experiment. The other experiment was to try and see if he could create a situation where every baby born in Germany, every Aryan baby, would have Aryan racial characteristics, which is blonde hair and blue eyes. And if you've ever seen a photograph of Mengele, he had brown hair and brown eyes. in any event, so in the wake of this letter, the Americans started looking for Mengele. They also launched an investigation to see if he had possibly entered the United States, because by this time the United States knew that thousands of Nazis had entered the United States, posing as innocent refugees. And the third investigation was to determine whether or not this was true. Now, that historical investigation was given to the Office of Special Investigations where I worked. I worked in Israel for them for 6 years. And my assignment was to try and find the informant, who we knew his name was David Freiman. He was a Jew from Lodz, among the last Jews deported to Auschwitz in September of '44. And he was sent to Mengele's he worked at Mengele's clinic. So in other words, he saw Mengele every day. Okay, but how do you find him? Where do you start? It's like looking for a needle in a haystack. It's 41 years after the end of World War II. Go find David Freiman. So I did most of my work at Yad Vashem, and one of my friends working there was David Silberklang, who for many years was the editor of Yad Vashem Studies, actually a student of my father's, by the way. Wow. Okay, and he suggested that I look in the files of the International Tracing Service, which were at Yad Vashem. Now, I never used this material, and I thought that it was a compilation of data on Jews who had been in Europe during the war or Jews who had survived. Anyway, it was created by the International Red Cross, which was getting millions of requests for information about family members who had been in Europe during the war and hadn't been heard from. Anyway, so I started looking, and the luckiest thing that happened to me was that these cards were organized not according to a regular alphabet. They were organized according to a phonetic alphabet, which means that double letters count as single letters, V and W count as the same letter, I, J, and Y count as the same letter. So it took me an hour to figure it out. And lo and behold, what did I learn during that hour? That the people in this list, in these files, most of them are non-Jews who were in displaced persons camps, who registered as refugees to get benefits as refugees from the International Red Cross. And I knew from my experience already that tens of thousands of Nazis who emigrated to Anglo-Saxon countries after the Holocaust fit that description. Now, there was no indication on the cards whether someone was a Nazi or not, but I had other sources, and the cards had their immigration destinations, when they left Germany or Austria, where they went, on what boat, on what date. In the case of the ones that went to America, a first address. Now, this material, this collection was in the hands of 11 different countries. The originals were in Germany, a place called Arlsen, near Frankfurt, and the others were in different countries. But none of those places gave anybody free access to look at those documents. The only place there was free access was in Yad Vashem in Israel. And that's the luckiest thing that ever happened to me, because we're talking 1986. The only country which had already decided, only Anglo-Saxon country, which had already decided to take legal action against Nazis was the Americans. Okay, they were doing it. They had a special office. I was working for them. Canada was investigating. Australia was investigating. Britain ostensibly didn't know that they had a problem. And the same is true of New Zealand. And I realized this is a historic moment. I'm in a position now to find thousands of Nazis who emigrated to these countries. And the only way we can get these 4 countries to take legal action against the Nazis is to flood them with the names of suspects and force them to understand, number one, this is not a matter of 1 or 2 Nazis. This is a matter of dozens, at least dozens and hundreds, if not thousands, of people who are mass murderers. And they can't just let them live in their democracies. So I couldn't do that working for the Americans, but I had worked for the Wiesenthal Center before I went back to Israel to work for the OSI, and actually that was my home. And I convinced the Wiesenthal Center to open an office in Jerusalem. I promised to send them the lists. And we started, the first list was 40 suspects to Australia.
So
Second
Brian,
list,
before you get on to that list, just close the loop for us in 10 seconds. Was Mengele still alive? What happened?
Okay, very important question. Mengele, once the Americans started looking for him, Israel joined in, Germany joined in, and they tracked him down after finding the copious correspondence between Mengele and his family in the offices of Hans Seidelmeyer, who was an official of the Mengele family operation. And it turns out that he had died of a stroke on February 7th, 1979, swimming in the Atlantic Ocean, and had been buried in a place called Embu, E-M-B-U, near Sao Paulo, under the name of Helmut Greger, which was his false name. And I want to tell one interesting insight. Listen, Mengele deserved the worst thing that man can invent to a person like him. But contrary to what many people think, he lived a miserable existence. He was angry at his family. He felt they didn't give him enough money. He was scared of being caught after what happened to Eichmann. And he felt abandoned and miserable, thank God. It couldn't have happened to a nicer person, really.
So now getting back to the story that you're telling us, you now are flooding all of these countries, United States, Canada, Australia, with lists of Nazis who've landed up living in those countries. Suspects. Now, I want to select a few stories because we have limited time. So I want to kind of you to tell us a few stories of some of those people who appeared on the list.
Okay, listen, first of all, I have to give you the good news, okay? Canada in 1987, Australia in 1989, UK in 1991, all passed special laws in their parliaments to allow criminal prosecution of the Nazi war criminals, okay? The only country that refused to do so was New Zealand. And they actually had far less than the other countries, far less suspects. But okay, if we take a look at the people who are on the list.
Well, so, let's talk about Australia. Let's talk about Carlos Carlos Ozols. That's a very sore point for me, I have to say. But okay, Carlos Ozols was on the first list to Australia. Carlos Ozols was a major, if I'm not mistaken, in a group called the Ares Commando. The Ares Commando was a Latvian murder squad headed by Victor Ares, who were involved in the mass murders in Riga, which took place on November 30th and December 8th, 1941, and later went from town to town throughout the countryside to mass murder together with local police, the Jews living in these communities. And they were nicknamed the men in the blue buses. And people knew, and as soon as the blue bus came, the Jews are finished. At a certain point in 42 or 43, half the Ares Commando was sent to Minsk to murder Jews in Belarus, among them Carlos Ozols. The other half was sent to fight partisans near the northern border near Estonia. Now, these people murdered at least 30,000 Latvian Jews, the Ares Commando, and they murdered thousands more. We don't know the exact number in Minsk. And there was obvious testimony that Carlos Ozols had given orders to shoot and had shot, and these are right on the edge of the pit. That was in the usual Holocaust by shooting, methods. And so he was very high on the list. Now, what happened was that in Australia, they had a special investigations unit called the SIU, which was officially established in 1889 when Australia passed the bill. It had actually been established earlier than that and helped convince the government to take the step. And the unit was opened and the bill was passed by the Bob Hawke government. But then Paul Keating became prime minister. And at the end, in June 30th, 1992, he pulled the plug on the unit, even though this was horrible timing, because once the Soviet Union crumbled, there was free access to the witnesses and free access to the archives. In other words, while the communists, the Soviets, were in power, you were totally dependent on them in terms of receiving documents and being able to find witnesses.
They did everything for you, and they gave you what they wanted you to have. It wasn't as if you could walk into an archives in Riga or in Vilna or in Tallinn or in Kiev or whatever, open up a catalog and say, well, would you please bring me, file 22 over B over C? I mean, that didn't exist. You told them who the suspects are. You told them what you're looking for. And then you had to depend on them. And who knows how many of those people weren't communist spies already in the Anglo-Saxon countries, and the communists were protecting them. That's also possible. But once the Soviet Union crumbled, that increased the chances of successful prosecution many times over. Now, what the government said was that we're disbanding the Special Investigations Unit, but the Australian Federal Police can take care of these cases. And all they needed was one more investigation of Carlos Ozos, and they could close the case and bring him to justice. And the government refused to approve the money. And Carlos Ozos died in peace and tranquility in Thomastown in Melbourne. He was the Victoria chess champion 8 years running. He taught Jewish children chess in St. Kilda's neighborhood. And a lot of Jews were living there. And it's a shame, not to mention that Conrad Calais, also an officer in the RA's Commando, wasn't put on trial in Australia. And Leonas Pazouzas from one of the worst murder squads in Eastern Europe, in the Lithuanian Ypatinga borders.
Well, let's get, before we get onto Leonas Pazouzas, because I think he's of interest because he operated in Lithuania. In fact, he was responsible for probably the death of 70,000 people in Lithuania.
Not personally 70,000, but his unit murdered 70,000.
His unit, but I just want so Carl Azolis goes from murdering Jewish kids to teaching them chess.
That's what happened. That's a fact.
There's this almost this weird thing that we were talking to Tali about earlier, how they weren't mass murderers before, they weren't mass murderers afterwards. It's almost like a period of their life where something bizarre happens.
Listen, that's very true. And what Tali said was very correct. In other words, we're dealing with 99%, 98% of the people I dealt with were normative people. They weren't involved in criminal activity before the Shoah. They weren't involved in criminal activity after the Shoah. But during the Shoah, they did things that were absolutely horrible. One of the people I identified as a killer was a man named Karoli Zente, or Charles Zente, in Australia, lived in Perth. And he murdered an 18-year-old Jewish boy named Peter Balash, whom he caught on a tram without the yellow star. And he knew he was Jewish because they grew up in the same neighborhood in Budapest, in the same suburb, Budapest. Okay, and he took him, he was a NCO in the Hungarian army. He took him to his barracks, beat him to death, and then with two accomplices, and then threw his body into the Danube. Now, when I got the Hungarians to ask for his extradition, okay, and this issue became very, very important, obviously, in Australia. And I came to Australia to speak to Jewish communities all over the country, and Zente's children heard that I was coming. So they wanted to meet with me. So I half jokingly said, I first checked the gun laws in Australia to see that they wouldn't try and kill me. But in any event, they came to me and they said, listen, he was a good dad. I said, that's possible, but that's not the issue. This is not about whether he was a good parent to you and he treated you fairly. This is about what he did during World War II. And you have absolutely no idea and no knowledge of what actually he did. And you know what? I feel for you because you're not alone. So many families had absolutely no idea what their loved ones did during the war. And in this case of Zente, there's a really interesting thing that happened. We found him living in Perth. We had his address, but we didn't know what his state of health was. So I made a deal with Channel 9 in Australia to stake out his house, to film him and see what his state of health was. So he got into his car, he drove away, he came back, and then they confronted him. And he's about to be exposed on national television, okay? So they interviewed him, he said he didn't do it, etc. Then they asked him, is there anything else you want to say? He said, yes, don't tell my family. Okay, he's about to be exposed on national television. Everyone in Australia is going to know who Karoli or Charles Zente is. But for him, the most important thing was his family, of course.
Yeah. So Ephraim, I know we're running short of time, so I want to go through two stories very quickly, and I want to actually just tell you that in the Q&A section, someone who has grown up in Namibia has spoken about the number of Germans that fled, Nazis who fled to Namibia, which was of course a German colony, to places like Swakopmund, and lived freely in Swakopmund after the Second World War in Namibia. But so just very quickly, I want to talk about two things. I want to just touch on Leonis Pazusis because of his Lithuanian link. If you can just give us 1 or 2 minutes on that. And then there's a success story about bringing someone, extraditing them from Argentina to Croatia to stand trial. So give us a 1 minute. Explain to us a little bit about Leonis Pazusis.
One of the worst murder squads in World War II was a unit called Ypatinga Buris, which means the special ones, which were the ones who murdered the Jews who were brought to Ponar, or Panarai in Lithuanian, a forest 12 kilometers outside Vilna. And the Jews of Vilna were murdered there, but also the Jews of Shventsian and some other places around the area. And the estimate is that 100,000 people were murdered there, but not all of them Jews. 70,000 Jews were murdered there, making it one of the biggest mass murder sites in Europe. Okay, Leonis Pazusis served as a member of the Ypatinga Buris, came to Australia, lived in Brisbane, and they didn't touch him. And it staggers the imagination how they could let a person like this get away with it. But the Australian, I have to say, the Australian effort, on the one hand, it was very important morally, judicially, to pass the law to enable prosecution, but all their prosecutions failed.
But there have been successes. So let's talk about Dinko Šakić.
Okay, Dinko Šakić. In 1941, the Germans and Italians occupied Yugoslavia, cut the country up into different pieces, one of which was the independent state of Croatia. The independent state of Croatia consisted of what's today Croatia, plus Bosnia-Herzegovina, and a slice of Serbia. And this country was given on a silver platter to a terror organization called the Ustasha. Ustasha wanted Croatia to separate from Yugoslavia because they hated the Serbs and they felt that the Serbs had dominated Yugoslavia. And in any event, they were notoriously anti-Semitic, anti-Roma, and of course were opposed to their political opponents. So the territory that they received was full of these minorities that they hated. And from the very minute that they took over, they set up concentration camps, the largest of which was the camp called Yasenovats, where there were at least 100,000 victims. Most of them were Serbs, 18,000 Jews, 13,000 Roma, approximately about the same. Now, excuse me, there's a debate over how many Jews, between 13 and 18,000 Jews, some 18,000 Roma, and thousands of their political enemies. No gas chambers, no gas fans, murdered individually in the most horrific way, the most painful to the victims. They even invented daggers that caused more pain when they killed the victims. I mean, it was just unbelievable. There wasn't a single German or Austrian anywhere near there. Okay, so one of the commanders was a man named Dinko Šakić. Dinko Šakić was the commander at age 24. He became the commander of Yasenovats because he was a fanatic Ustasha, and he was the boyfriend of Nada, who is the half sister of Max Luberic, who was the Ustasha in charge of all the concentration camps. Anyway, a lot of these Croatians were able to escape using the rat lines, the escape network set up by the Austrian bishop, Alias Hudel, who had a seminary in Rome. And his deputy was a Ustasha priest named Krunoslav Dragonovic. So Argentina was the best haven for Nazis in South America. There were other havens like Brazil and Paraguay and Bolivia and Chile, but the best was Argentina. We know today, thanks to a fantastic book by the Argentinian journalist, the real Odessa, Uki Goni, his name is, G-O-N-I, he's from Basque origin, that the Argentinians actually went looking for these people. They went looking for Nazis to bring them to Argentina and give them a haven. Among them, Šakić, and Ante Pavelić was the head of state of the independent state of Croatia, one of the biggest mass murderers in World War II. In any event, we found Šakić, we exposed him. We sent a journalist to film an interview with him and expose him nationally. And this journalist we had sent to Yugoslavia to meet with survivors of Yasenovats before he went to confront Šakić. So he goes to Šakić's house, knocks on the door. Šakić comes to the door. Are you Dinko Šakić? Yes. You are the commander of Yasenovats. He goes, yes. Let me stop there for a minute. Usually when Nazis are about to be exposed, there's two answers. One, it's mistaken identity. It's not me, or it's me, but I didn't do it. What does Dinko Šakić say? It's me, I did it, and I would do it again. So Jorge Camarasa, who is the journalist who went with the TV crew, asked Šakić if he can ask him a few questions. So they sit down in Šakić's home, and Camarasa says to him, listen, you ran the worst camp in the Balkans. By the way, the nickname of Yasenovats was the Auschwitz of the Balkans. Okay? How do you explain what happened there? The death rate, the horrible executions, the torture, everything. He says, what's the problem? Yasenovats was a penal colony, and every country has a penal colony. And every person who was in Yasenovats deserved to be there. So Camarasa says to him, listen, buddy, not buddies, listen, Mr. Šakić, you can't fool me. I met the survivors. I know what happened. I know about the death rate and everything. Šakić says, nah, maybe there was a little typhus. But you don't get it. You know what the problem with the Yasenovats was? They didn't let us finish the job. Now, when did he say this? Not 1945, when they closed down Yasenovats in April. More than 50 years later, this is what he says. In other words, totally unrepentant. Now, we had a whole debate, the dilemma where to send him, where he should be put on trial. If we were thinking only result, it would have been to Belgrade, because he would have been hung from the highest tree in Belgrade 5 minutes after he got convicted. But the question that we asked ourselves was, who needs the lesson of Yasenovats the most? Obviously the Croatians, where Ustaša nostalgia is very strong. Just to give you a little example, I'm speaking to many South Africans, and they know a little bit about football. So in the 1998 Mondial, in the World Cup of 1998 that took place in France, the quarterfinals match between Germany and Croatia, Saturday, July 4th, the biggest upset in World Cup history. Croatia beats Germany 3-0. I was in Zagreb. I'm walking, during the first half, I'm walking through the street. All of a sudden, the street shakes. What happened? Croatia scored a goal. It wasn't an earthquake. Croatia scored a goal. Everyone's going crazy. The street is shaking. After the win, the fantastic win, I went out to see the celebrations. Within 3 minutes, outside the hotel, I see a group of 7 young men approaching me with a large flag, and I'm standing there wearing a yarmulke, okay? And they're yelling at the top of their lungs, Dinko Šakić, Dinko Šakić. Now, where's Dinko Šakić? He's in jail awaiting trial for mass murder. He didn't score the goals for Croatia in the World Cup, right? Why are they yelling his name? Why is he a hero? Because he knew how to deal with the hated Serbs, the disgusting gypsies, the horrible Jews. And these are people who think that you solve your problems by killing your enemies.
So Ephraim, tell us how that story ends.
Okay, the story ends very nicely. The trial was run effectively and was given mass exposure by Judge Drazen Tripalo, who today is sitting on the Supreme Court in Croatia. Šakić was sentenced to the full sentence, 20 years in prison. And just very briefly, two quick stories that I think are illuminating. One was probably the most horrifying testimony. It was of a Jew, Yaakov Finci, who at the age of 15 was taken to Yasenovats with other Jews from Sarajevo, young Jews his age. A couple of days after they were in the camp, they were taken by the guards. The guards had murdered quite a few inmates, and after they murdered them, they hacked off their arms and legs, and there was a pile of body parts at the edge of the camp where the Sava River ran, along the border of the camp. They took these boys and they told them, your job is to throw the body parts into the river. So Yaakov Finci turned around to the guard and he said to him, why are you doing this to us? So the guard said to him, because you murdered Jesus. He knew he was a Jew. In other words, you want to understand how you get Yasenovats? You take hundreds of years of Christian anti-Semitism, you add the fascism of Ustaša and the racism of the Nazis, even though there are no Nazis there in the camp at all, that's how you get Yasenovats. But one last story. On the day of the verdict, the place was packed. The problem was half the people were in favor of Šakić, half the people were against Šakić. And fistfights broke out and people were spat at. It was crazy, absolutely mad. I'm walking out of the courtroom and all of a sudden a tall, well-dressed gentleman stops me. And he says to me, listen, I have only one word to say to you. In Croatian, it's one word, hvala. Hvala means thank you. He says, if not for you, the trial wouldn't have taken place. Now, I had no idea who this was. So I asked someone, who is this guy? He seemed to have some connection to the prosecution. So he said, listen, the story goes like this. In April of 1944, there was an incident when inmates broke discipline. They violated the discipline of the camp. Šakić immediately calls roll call. All the inmates have to appear in the central square of Yasenovats, line up. And he's walking up and down the lines and totally at random taking out people who are going to be hung in reprisal for the breach of discipline. One of the people whom he chose was a doctor from Montenegro, non-Jew, by the name of Dr. Mile Bošković. So when Bošković was taken out of the line, he said to Šakić, I'm from Montenegro and my tradition doesn't allow me to be hung. Šakić on the spot takes out his revolver, shoots him in the head and murders him. The man who stopped me was his brother, who I can promise you never dreamt in a million years that Croatia would be a democracy, that Croatian democracy would put the ultra patriot Dinko Šakić on trial, convict him and send him off. And that's one of the things that Mr. Wiesenthal always emphasized. The debt we owe to the families, and the fact that it's very important to give them closure. That's the least they deserve for their loved ones. So when I get frustrated, when people, it's like Chatteri, Laszlo Chatteri died, the guy who sent 15,000 Jews to Auschwitz from Košice, died a week before he was put on trial. I think of Mile Bošković's brother. And that gives me a lot of hope and a lot of strength.
So Ephraim, your stories are remarkable. You've written 2 books. I'd like to ask Danny just to bring out the book covers. Tell us where we get hold of them. Are they available on Kindle, on Amazon?
They're available on Amazon. They're available on Kindle. They're available. The Wiesenthal Center has a bookstore, and all the usual online outlets.
So this is the first book, Operation Last Chance, and it's about your quest to bring Nazi war criminals to justice.
That's Dinko Šakić is on the right-hand side here. That's Dinko Šakić. Mengele is on the left. Next to Mengele is Dr. Aribert Heim, a doctor from Mauthausen who's the mini Mengele. And next to Šakić, in between Šakić and Heim, is Aleksandras Lalekas, the head of the Lithuanian security in Vilna, the Saugumas. They're the ones who guarded the ghetto, didn't allow anybody to escape, didn't allow anybody to help. And there was some people, Lithuanians, who tried to help and took the people from the ghetto to Ponar to be murdered.
So this is your first book. Your second book, you've written with Ruta Vanagaita, who's someone said to me is probably the most hated person in Lithuania at the moment, because it exposes your book so many of the war crimes that took place to so many members of our family in Lithuania. And the book is called Our People.
Right. In Lithuania, the subcaption was Journey with an Enemy. I'm the enemy, by the way. In other words, Ruta, the Lithuanian, went with the most hated Jew in Lithuania. That's me. But notice the 2 faces on the cover that you can see through the letters. Basically, the message that we wanted to send was, for Lithuanian society, neither the Jews, the victims, nor the killers are considered part of Lithuanian society. The Jews are disregarded because, they were all communists, they exploited us, they sent us to Siberia, and the killers are a bunch of degenerates. We, of course, disproved that, and we showed that all strata of Lithuanian society participated in the murders. So on top is a picture of Balis Norvegia, who was the commander of the Ypatinga that I mentioned, the Lithuanian killing squad. But this face is super interesting. This is Yitzhak Anolik, who represented Lithuania in 2 Olympics. in London and in Amsterdam, 1924, 1928, as a cyclist. And as Ruta said so wisely, good enough to represent us in the Olympics, not good enough to live. Murdered in the Kovna ghetto.
So Ephraim, there are a lot of people who want to be in touch with you as well. Can we give out your Twitter handle for people so they are
by all means? You can give out my Twitter handle, you can give out my email, and you can whatever. I mean, as you probably know, I have many relatives in South Africa, and because my grandfather was one of 6 boys, and 2 of them went to South Africa. So and one of them was killed in Vilna, and I'm named for him. So
Ephraim, we've put your Twitter details into the chat on YouTube, on Facebook, on Zoom. Anyone who wants to get in touch with you, absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. These stories are remarkable and riveting. We're going to bounce around a little at the moment because I know, Mark Drumble, you need to leave us at 10 o'clock in about 45 minutes time. So there are some elements that we want to discuss with you relating to this story. So if I could ask you to turn on your camera and to unmute yourself, we'll come back to you to talk about the Rwandan story a little later. But let's just talk about one of the things that you've written about are trials that people don't know about, and that is the Capo trials that took place in Israel after the Second World War. Explain to us, what is a Capo?
Oh, sure, absolutely. Well, first of all, Ephraim, thank you for your absolutely riveting remarks and your work, and Howard and Tali for including me in this. So one area of interest that I have is the role, the space for justice to interface with very low-level perpetrators who may also be victims and who may wield very little authority, but who actually may lord over in many ways others. So Howard, to answer your question, a capo is a category of detainees and inmates, prisoners in the Nazi labor and death camps, mostly in the labor camps. And what the Nazis did, I think one of the cruelest aspects of the final solution and the maintenance and administration of the death camps was the creation of what the Nazis called prisoner self-administration. And roughly, 10% of detainees in these camps served in this administrative capacity. And the capo was a category of prisoner who did this. They would often serve as chiefs of the barracks. They would maintain order among prisoners. They would become involved sometimes in decision-making about who would live or who would die. Some of them became integrated into the running of the camp, sometimes in administrative positions, sometimes in positions related to expertise they may have had. And I think that the capo is a very problematic and difficult figure. Because in the case of Auschwitz, for example, many capos were drawn from the inmate population, and this meant that we had a scenario in which Jewish inmates would become capos and would operate in this capacity. So that's a capo. And if you'd like me to continue quickly, I can talk about.
So at the end of the Second World War, and I think people don't know it, some of these capos actually went on trial in Israel for what they had done while working as surrogates for the Nazis.
Yes. So after 1948, Israel adopted a statute called the Nazi and Nazi Collaborators Punishment Act. And I know that there's a speaker who will be talking about the Demjanjuk trial. And John Demjanjuk, was prosecuted under this. So too was Adolf Eichmann. But the initial impetus behind this particular statute was to recognize that after the Holocaust and the creation of the State of Israel, numbers of individuals who arrived in Israel as victims ended up in scenarios were often through random street encounters, stories different than Ephraim's, but also stories in the sense of individuals who meet other individuals, whether on the beach, whether in the park, whether at an ice cream stand on the streets of Tel Aviv. Individuals meet others and they look at the other and they realize that that other occupied an administrative position in Auschwitz or other camps. And the law that was passed constructed there were roughly 40 Capo trials. And these were very poignant and painful, very difficult. Many of them were brought at the behests of victims and survivors in Israel. And these particular trials occupied a space in which law addressed the most painful, the toughest question. And that is, what does one do with a persecuted victim who becomes involved in the persecution of others? And to me, when we think of justice, when we think of post-conflict reconstruction, when we think of both never again, but also building a better world, these are conversations that also have to occur. And they happened in Israeli courts at that time.
Yeah.
Tali, do you have some questions for Mark?
Yeah, please, Mark. So the whole issue of victims who victimize is very painful because, of course, for many, and couples were not always Jewish. I mean, you had Jewish and non-Jewish. And trials, if I remember, your lecture happened in Israel, but also, I think, in Poland, if I'm not mistaken. Can you speak maybe about one case and also what actually happened in those trials? What can you paint a picture around those very painful trials?
Yes, and I think the picture that I would like to paint is probably less one of any individual story. I think what I would probably like to paint is a picture that has three commonalities among all trials when we deal with the realities of victims who become victimizers. Capos are one example. Other examples are child soldiers. Other examples are extremely, extremely powerless people who become recruited into violent gangs and violent militia. So there's a number of categories. So the Capo is a starting point for this conversation, but I think what I'd like to express is the conversation is far broader. And in fact, the most recent conviction at the International Criminal Courts in February of 2021, Dominic Ongwen, a former child soldier in the Lord's Resistance Army in northern Uganda, who became a brigadier commander and was convicted of a number of truly disturbing charges in terms of the facts. So I think there's three important points. First, I think there is a reality that powerless people can really hurt others, that perpetrators can be tragic. We hear from Ephraim in his presentation of numbers of perpetrators who actually may wield a fair bit of authority and are not coming from groups that may be subordinated. But large numbers of perpetrators do. And if we're truly going to have a conversation about law in this frame, I think we have to recognize that when one is a victim, whether one is victimized by an all-powerful perpetrator or one is victimized by the meek and the weak, that hurt still feels the same. And I think it's very important for us to recognize that if law focuses only on acts of abuse and on acts of violence as orchestrated by the strongest, I think we lose a lot in that particular justice frame. Yeah. Secondly, I think what's also very important to recognize is the Israeli Capo trial struggled enormously with issues of guilt, responsibility, agency, and mental intent. And law always tends to require proof of those things in order for a prosecutor to convince that an individual is guilty. Like Hannah Arendt wrote about Eichmann at Jerusalem, that the trial is only about the perpetrator sitting in the Zok, and that individual's guilt and that individual's power. And if we're unable to show that from the prosecutorial side, we lead to these very, very awkward outcomes and awkward results. And then there's a third thing in all of these cases. And the third thing in all of these cases is, how do you sentence someone if you've convicted them when they come at violence from this incredibly subordinated and powerless position? How do you do that? And at the end of the day, Tali, yes, law and justice is about stories and individual narratives, but it's also about principles. It's also about predictabilities. It's also about precedent. And I think there's a real tension in law between the pursuits of individual justice and the creation of broader principles about how justice should be achieved. And I think in this sense, criminal law and criminal trials can only occupy a smaller or more modest role. And I remember this in my own work in Rwanda, where I worked as a public defender in Kigali after the genocide against the Tutsi. And I had numbers of clients there. And the main goal at that point was simply to obtain a dossier against the person who was accused and ensure that there was a hearing and ensure that as best as could be, the truth comes out. But I also had clients who were very young. There were many children were brutally victimized in the Rwandan genocide, but there were also adolescents who committed terrible acts of atrocity. And what does one do in those situations? Because one person's story is another person's principle. And I think it's very, very important to recognize that, especially if law is to be predictable.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you very much for making it complex for us, you know, and I think starting with the Capo trials, but then speaking about the child soldier case that became a victimizer himself in northern Uganda is really important. I want us to move to the aging perpetrators. That is your latest research. We see, and we saw in the film, Oskar Gröning at 95, standing on trial. Soon we will see Demjanjuk in Germany at 92, standing on trial. Of course, in Cambodia, lately the IEC trials, also very aging survivors. Speak to us about that. I mean, there is sort of a Walking Dead kind of imagery that comes to mind. Is justice... What about justice for the over 90s mass killers?
Yes, so I think the pursuit of justice can sometimes take an extremely long time. Whether it's related to the Holocaust, whether it's the genocide against the Tutsi, in any frame that's similar. And then often when there's an enormous lag time, as there also was in Cambodia, as you pointed out, Tali, where we last met, you have defendants who then are extremely aged. And there's a whole set of legal concerns, and then there's a whole set of what I would talk about as aesthetic or visual concerns. The legal concerns are, of course, how solid is evidence with the passage of large lengths of time, how competent or capable is the defendant, when an aged person, an aged Nazi is put on trial, as there have been recent cases in Germany, every morning, I suspect the prosecutor wakes up and every morning says a prayer that the defendant will remain viable for the course of that day in the trial and be able to continue. So there's a whole set of legal concerns, but I think there's also these aesthetic or visual concerns. And I think this opens up on multiple fronts. First, as clearly I think was the case in a number of prosecutions of older Nazis, we learned early the Oskar Gröning case, Demjanjuk, sometimes the defendant can engage in antics. The defendant can, at times, as happened in Cambodia as well, exaggerate a sense of, oh, I don't know what's going on, engage in hyperbole, demonstrate often in an exaggerated sense a lack of capacity. And there's a gamesmanship that happens. But then on the other hand, you have the troubling reality that defendants look so weak when they once were so strong. And what I find particularly fascinating about this and how it maps onto the earlier points that I made about tragic perpetrators. Perhaps it's not a bad thing for us to have telegraphed into living rooms or on newspapers imagery of extremely elderly, weak and meek individuals, because perhaps it reminds us that weak and meek people themselves may really hurt others, and perhaps those trials can make us less squeamish or less uncomfortable with having conversations about the reality that in order for atrocity to become truly massive, large numbers of people have to become involved in its perpetration. I also think, on the other hand, at the end of the day, if we say that the expressive value of justice is important, then it is important to have a very elderly person face some kinds of a reckoning. Even if it becomes very difficult to imprison that individual, it becomes very problematic to create a context in which they can ever offer restitution. There still is the visuality that one cannot always elude justice through the passage of time.
And
one really interesting.
That's a very important lesson. And
But
I think in the clip we showed when the CNN announcer said, you know, justice should have no time limit.
Yeah.
Mark,
So
I know we're running out of time, and we have to tell
one
the story.
very-
So I'm going to ask
minute.
you to last minute.
Yeah,
please.
absolutely, because I'll end on a story. So there's one fascinating trial that had been underway in Germany of a man called Bruno Day. And he was a guard at a camp in Poland. He was 17 years old. And then he becomes prosecuted now on enormous numbers of counts of atrocity in his role in mass murder at the camp. Because he's 17 at the time, and he's now in his 90s, he's being prosecuted in juvenile court. I believe it's in Hamburg. And that's where his prosecution is taking place. And to me, I just wanted to say that as a vignette to close out, how these life cycles sometimes come in full circle. And in this frame, it's a very fascinating paradox that someone so old faces justice for what was done when he was so young, and it occurs with the protections of juvenile court.
Wow.
Thank you.
Wow. Mark, thank you so much for joining us this evening. So appreciate your time, and I know you have to rush off, but we are so grateful that you were able to share those stories with us. Tali, there are two more stories we want to tell tonight. The one story is we want to tell about the genocide against the Tutsis in Rwanda, and the other story is we want to tell the story of John Demjanjuk. You, I presume, have seen the Netflix documentary series, The Devil Next Door.
Absolutely, and I really recommend it to everyone. It's a 4-part series, not an easy watch because, of course, we all know the end result of that story. It's not a good one.
I think a lot of people may not know the end result of that story. I sat in on his trial. I spent a day in Jerusalem at Binyanei Hauma, busy listening in as they tried to prove whether this man was Ivan the Terrible or not. Oh. But a day or two ago, we actually sat down with Tamir Hod, who features very prominently in the documentary, and we had a discussion about the Demjanjuk trial, and we'd love just to show it to people quickly, and then we're going to go on and talk about the genocide against the Tutsis in Rwanda. So Tali, if I could ask you to turn off your microphone and camera.
John Demjanjuk, he was a family man.
He was living the American dream. He was a good American citizen. Up until the government came along and said he was Ivan the Terrible.
Charges were filed today against John Demjanjuk. The 66-year-old Ukrainian native is accused of being a Nazi death camp guard named Ivan the Terrible.
The crimes that he was accused of were horrid.
The Israeli government is seeking his extradition as a war criminal.
And that's where the drama begins.
לא היית שמה, אני אשאל אותו, הוא יגיד לך מה.
На моїм серці, моє серце є чисте.
Once the survivors began to testify, it became a national obsession.
It was a zoo. There were news crews parked halfway down the street.
His wife couldn't believe what was going on.
We were looking at the fact that we may never see him again, and they're going to put him to death in Israel.
The Justice Department presented evidence right from the KGB.
I was sure that I would destroy the show.
There was some rotten going on.
Our father's a very kind person, a very gentle person.
Are you sure you're not making a mistake?
Everybody in the courtroom went,
Demjanjuk could have been a monster or a victim of wrong identity. My deepest fear is that I think he can be anybody.
We're joined now by Tamir Hood, who joins us from Kibbutz Nir, just in the north of Israel. Now, Tamir, many people watching would have seen the Netflix documentary about the devil next door, the story of John Demjanjuk. Who was John Demjanjuk and how did he appear on people's radar?
Okay, so actually our story began in the middle of the 70s. In 1975, a list arrived in the US containing 73 names of Americans, citizens of Ukrainian extraction, and they were suspected of having collaborated with the Nazis during the Holocaust years. So the suspected collaborators deceived the American immigration authorities as to their deeds during the World War II and the Holocaust. Because after World War II, more than 400,000 people from all different nationalities immigrated to United States. And we know that 5% of them were Nazis and Nazis collaborators. And the amazing details is that from the end of World War II until the mid-70s, only 9 cases were tried in court in the United States. So when that list arrived to the United States, it was for many American citizens like a big surprise. And if you watch the trailer of the series, it begins with the words, John Demjanjuk, he was a family guy. One of the American investigators from the OSI, Office for Special Investigation, gave those group the name the Quiet Neighbors. So they lived like a regular American life until that information arrived from the Soviet Union. And I'm always thinking about the younger son of John Demjanjuk, John Jr., because he opened the door to the INS when they arrived in the middle of the 70s.
Sorry, what is the INS?
INS is the immigration department that deal with those collaborators, the people that were suspected as collaborators, because the law in the state can't deal with something that they did outside of United States. So they try them of lying in their application, in their immigration form. So it's a civilian law.
So what was the link between this list of 73 collaborators or Nazis and this retired auto worker in Cleveland, Ohio?
Beside the name John Demjanjuk, there were two camp names, two names of two camps. One is Oksau, that it was like a work camp, and the other one, more familiar to our audience, is Sobibor, part of three camps of the Operation Reinhardt.
And that starts an extradition. How does that happen? Where does he get extradited to? Walk us through the extradition process.
Now, the NS, they look for survivors. So there are some survivors in the state, but they will know that if they want to seek wider, they will look for the survivors in Israel. And they send a box with photos of people who suspected to collaborate with the Nazis. And then there is like a identity parade in Israel in May 1976. And an officer, police officer, Miriam Redifker, she ran it. And she described to the court in Israel in 1987 that one of the first survivors that got in looked at the photos, put his fingers on the photo of Demjanjuk, and said, "This guy, I know him. This is Ivan the Terrible from Treblinka." Now, we have to understand, there's a big gap between some guard from Sobibor, Demjanjuk, no one heard about him before, and Ivan the Terrible, because he was one of the most notorious collaborators during the Holocaust, activated the diesel engine machine that filled the gas into to the cell. And he was also known as savage cruelty, torturing the victims on the way to their death. So one of the survivors put his finger on the photo and said, "This is Ivan the Terrible." And Miriam Redifker, she told this survivor, "It can't be." The American said that this guy, he was in Sobibor. And the American authority never wrong, never make any mistake. So go back to your home, I'll meet you tomorrow and we'll do it again. But then you have another 7 survivors that recognize Demjanjuk as Ivan the Terrible. We have 13 that didn't, but still. And Miriam Redifker sent the box back to the United States and said, "I think you were wrong. My survivor is saying that this guy was in Treblinka."
So how long did it take to extradite him to Israel?
Okay, so in 1981, a trial began in the US that in front of Judge Battisti, that ultimately determined that Demjanjuk was indeed Ivan the Terrible, and that he had submitted false details in his immigration request. Thus, his US citizenship was revoked, and he was deported from the country.
So take us to the trial, and just in, I know it's impossible, but in sort of 3 minutes, 4 minutes, talk about the trial itself, because of course in this trial, like in the Eichmann trial, it was using survivors. Survivors' testimonies, but talk a little bit about it. And of course, Howard, you were in a day in that trial, and maybe you can share your recollections from 1987 in the trial. So Tamir, maybe you start broad brush strokes of the trial.
Yeah, so the trial opened in 16th of February 1987. It ended in April 1988, and the venue was chosen, we said it before, was the International Convention Center in Jerusalem. It wasn't for nothing. They needed a big place that many of the citizens could come and listen to the trial, and also for the media, because there were like 28 cameras from all over the world filming and televised the trials, most of them from the beginning to the end. And now there are many different between Demjanjuk and the trial that took place 25 years earlier in Israel, the Eichmann trial. But I want to point on one of them. With the Eichmann, there was no doubt, this is the guy, this is the one. There were other things that the Eichmann claimed against Israel that they can't try him, but there was no doubt. Eichmann also told to his captured, what took you so long, you know? So he was like waiting for them. But Demjanjuk, he said, everything you're going to describe here in court, it's true. Beside one fact, I'm not the guy that you are looking for. So we have a trial, you know, and they checked almost everything. I mean, it was sometimes it was so technically that the court got empty, you know, because people got bored. But
so just to understand that, his view is everything that you say about Ivan the Terrible is true. That's just not me. I am not Ivan the Terrible. You've got the wrong man.
Yeah, correct. And there is no doubt about Ivan the Terrible and who was he and what he did. I mean, we know that. We have enough academic works to read that. But Demjanjuk said, you got the wrong guy, okay? I'm not the one.
So how in the trial do they prove or try to prove that he is Ivan the Terrible?
So they focused on the testimonies of the survivors. And each one that deal in that academic field knows how complicated it is to base your work on memory. You have to compare between testimonies to come into historical fact. And that's what I'm always saying about this trial. Maybe we'll talk about it later and add some more details. But the Treblinka survivors' testimonies are very important for the historiographical about the Holocaust. But when you put it in trial, you got a problem, because if they are missing some of the details, you know the result. I mean, Demjanjuk was acquitted at the end.
Yeah. And it's 45 years later. I mean,
45 years later.
Yeah,
so
1943, the Treblinka is already closed. So
yeah.
Tell us about the survivors who come to give evidence.
Okay, so we had, I mean, let's talk about time and how it's important. Maybe even now that we are talking about the genocide in Rwanda or in Cambodia, yeah, let's talk about time. So we had 5 survivors that testified. We had Eliyahu Rosenberg, Yosef Cherny, Pinchas Epstein, Yechiel Eichner, and Gustav Borax, that already was a signal in when the trial began. But even so, their testimonies in the trials was, I mean, sometimes it was hard to listen. Judge Zvital told me, it's one of the main important testimonies in my research, told me that he was waiting for the breaks in the trials so he can go to his room and cry. That's how hard was to listen to those testimonies. But we also had a problem, and with memory, 40 years later. And even so, in April 1988, the district court, the special district court, ruled that Demjanjuk was guilty and sentenced him to death. In the verdict, it was stated that the judge had based their decision mainly on the testimonies of the survivors. And during the trial, it was evident that memory is a problematic instrument given to our physiological, social influences. And I mentioned Gustav Borax, that completely forgot the name of one of his sons that was murdered in Treblinka. More famous testimony was given by Eliyahu Rosenberg. He testified that in 47, that in the uprising in Treblinka, that took place in the 2nd of August, 1943, they killed Ivan the Terrible, yeah? And he gave another testimony in 1960, before Eichmann trial, And then again, he said that they killed all the Ukrainian guard in Treblinka camp. Now, we know that it's not true.
So the trial lasts for how long, and what happens at the end of the trial?
So the trial ended in 25 of April 1988. And then when you got so they gave him a death sentence.
Am I correct in saying only the second time ever in Israeli history that the death sentence has been handed down?
There was a Capo trial, Yechiel Egister, and he was sentenced to death, but immediately was changed to 2 years, and he was released after a few months and died because he was severely ill.
But Eichmann is the only one ever to be executed in Israel.
Yeah, in the Holocaust trial. So Demjanjuk was really close to that, but we will soon talk about what made him free.
So he is convinced as being Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka. That is, in the end, what the judges decided. They are listening to the survivors. Yes. They are accusing him of being Ivan the Terrible. So maybe very briefly then talk about the appeal, because he was not hanged, of course, and he was found not guilty after the appeal. Maybe make the connections for us.
So when there is a death sentence, there's the appeal automatically. But his Israeli Jewish attorney defense, Yoram Sheftel, that for many years was maybe one of the most hated person in Israel for representing a collaborator, was starting to prepare himself to that stage in the Supreme Court. And I must say that if it would open in the origin time, that supposed to be December 1988, for sure, Demjanjuk was dead, because there was nothing new with the evidence in that time. But a few things that happened, like outside the court, changed everything. And one of them is that a guy named, he was a judge before that, but now an attorney, Dov Eitan, joined Yoram Sheftel, and there was a lot of threats on his life, and we don't have the precise answer until now, but he jumped to death few days before the appeal was supposed to open. And then in the funeral, there was a toxic oxygen that was thrown to Sheftel's eyes. So now we got the appeal 1 year later to May 90. In that time, the Iron Curtain fell, which permitted access to various archive sources, which now open up to the West. The defense gathered evidence that caused doubt as to whether Demjanjuk was indeed Ivan the Terrible in Treblinka. In the KGB file located in the former Soviet Union, evidence was found according to which Ivan the Terrible was Ivan Marchenko, whose outward description was different from Demjanjuk. Even, one of the female witnesses that served in Treblinka said that she was Ivan the Terrible lover, and he told her in person that he is the one that activated the diesel engine, and she described totally different person. So the evidence were collect one to another and brought that the Supreme Court to decide they are sentencing him and deported him back to the United States for a reasonable doubt. But now I must add something that is just amazing, because the Supreme Court stated that John Demjanjuk was a Wachman, was a guard during World War II, but he is not Ivan the Terrible.
So the court says he is a Nazi criminal. He is just not Ivan the Terrible.
That one, yeah.
Yeah.
He's just not that Nazi criminal.
Yeah, Lawrence Douglas, that wrote a book about it, gave it a perfect title. He called it The Right Wrong Man.
Exactly.
The Right Wrong Man. The problem was that all the procedure was focusing on Treblinka. But if you started with tried him on being a Wachman, being a guard, you had the documents. I mean, the Treblinka documents kept staying authentic in front of the court. So there was a case of mistaken identity.
And the accusation, if they would have just accused him of collaborating with the Nazis and being, for example, in Treblinka, and he would have been found guilty. So it was that accusation of being that specific man that there's no doubt that he was not Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka.
Yeah.
So he went back to the United States, but then, of course, he goes years later to trial in Germany. Can you close the story with the last trial and his death?
And that's why they decided to end the story, send him back to deport him to United States. The authority in United States couldn't leave the case. And then again, in 2009, he was deported to Germany, and they put him on trial now of being John Demjanjuk from Sobibor. Not only Sobibor, but another camps, but Sobibor was in the heart of the case. And they came up with a legal precedent. They said, okay, we've got the date. He served at Sobibor from this day to that day. From this month to that month, or any date that they had, 28,500 Jewish were killed. For us, it doesn't matter what he did. He could stand in on the tower. By doing that, he avoided them from running away. So he took part of the murder, and they sent him to 5 years in prison. Now, if you ask me, I prefer that they are just setting him free and send him back to his home, because if you calculate that, it's like 1.5 hours for each victim. 1.5 hours for each victim. But then he appealed again, and he died at the age of 92.
But there's an interesting legal precedent, because he appeals, and by German law, because he's appealed, the conviction doesn't stick. So he actually dies with no criminal record.
That's true, Howard. And even I have to come with the objective academic hat, I will say that it's very frustrating. I mean, we have facts here, we have evidence, and it's correct what you said. I mean, he was never sitting in trial as a guilty person. It was all during a procedure, and I think it was a huge mistake by the Israeli authority. They could do better in this case.
So, Tamir, many people will know the story of Demjanjuk and Demjanjuk's trial from the Netflix show The Devil Next Door. How did you come to the story?
Yeah, okay, so I was a teenager when the trial began. My personal relation to the affair began before I started my PhD, because I was working with Holocaust memory and wrote about it a lot. And many of my family, my father's family, died in Warsaw Ghetto, and some of them in Treblinka. So the connection was very direct. And there were a few times, I mean, I told you before that about Gustav Borak's testimony, for instance, that I really thought of leaving the case. But I found it very important also, you know, to do some justice with those Treblinka survivors, because they weren't blamed for what happened at the end. They did the best they could, and there were many influences on their testimonies. So I found it's very important to write this research, and later on it appears as a book that I called him Remember to Forget, because right after the end of the trial, at the end of July 1993, it actually disappeared from the educational system in Israel and from television series. You couldn't hear about it until the series came out and my book. Because sometimes states can't really deal with failures, you know.
Tamir, how popular has the Netflix series been?
Yeah, and the series is on Netflix, South Africa. So for all those that didn't see The Devil Next Door, it's a 4-part series. Tamir is there is one of the main commentators, but it's fascinating. It's like a real-time thriller, and I really highly recommend for everyone to watch it.
We know that millions from all over the world watch the series and find it fascinating. It's hard to watch.
It's devastating to watch, in fact.
Yeah, and you know, like in Israel, like many of the people that didn't remember a single detail about the affair was shocked from what they saw in the series. I mean, how could it be? It's happened while I was a growing person and I didn't notice. They didn't remember that the lawyer that jumped to his death, the toxic oxygen that was thrown on Sheftel's face, and all of that events that caused the trial ended the way it ended. I can tell you for sure that it's so popular around the world that I'm getting messages from South Africa, from India, from Zanzibar, from all over the world.
Yeah. Tamir, finally, will there ever be another Holocaust trial in Israel again?
For 100% not. And even if you were, like, if you asked me the question 20 years earlier, I will give you the same answer. And let's talk about, again, about the effect of the Demjanjuk trial, because in the Israeli police, there was a decision that from now, the end of the Demjanjuk trial, they will only help to other countries to put Nazis or Nazis collaborators on trial. They won't do it here in Israel. That's how the verdict of the Supreme Court was traumatic for the authorities in Israel. Memory, it's a fragile tool, we all know that, especially if it's 4 years after what happened and with such a traumatic case.
Tamir Hod, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Tali, truly devastating, but as he said, memory is a fragile tool.
Absolutely, and yeah, it's one of those stories that really stays quite heavily with you. And some of the comments on the chat, Herschel Jawitz is saying there were parts I couldn't watch. It was so traumatic, and specifically when actually in the end he was not convicted. He does not have criminal record.
He dies an unconvicted man.
Yeah. Yeah.
But Tali, close to home, and today is a very significant day. The 7th of April marks the 27th anniversary of the start of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. And we're going to speak now to Mark Gacaca about that and about his personal story and about what's happening in Rwanda today. But before we do that, just to give people some context, we're just going to show a very short video that will describe what 27 years ago looked like in that part of the world.
In Africa today, a plane carrying the presidents of 2 African nations has apparently been shot down as it was coming in for a landing in the capital of Rwanda. UN officials say that both presidents were killed. They're the leader of Rwanda.
3 months before the genocide began, General Dallaire had learned of extremist plans for mass murder and told his UN superiors that he was going to seize an arms cache.
The response was immediate, within hours, that I was not authorized, it was outside my mandate, and that I was jeopardizing the whole mission. Well, on the 6th of April, the war started. Within 24 hours, I had 10 soldiers dead, but already thousands of Rwandans were being slaughtered.
April 7th, 1994. The tiny Central African country of Rwanda appeared today to have descended into chaos. The best estimate now looking back is about 800,000 people were killed in 100 days of chaos, of violence there. That's 56,000 people being killed every week. Or if you break it down even further, that's 8,000 people a day being killed, or 333 people being killed every hour for 100 days, for 100 days. That almost screams out to you that the entire population was involved, as it was. Neighbors were killing neighbors. Hutu and Tutsi who had lived peacefully next to each other suddenly became enemies, and the Hutu would go over and just slaughter the Tutsi neighbor. They were able to kill 800,000 people with very low-tech means. I'm talking machetes, I'm talking with knives, I'm talking with gardening tools. It was just basically a low-tech genocide.
800,000 people were slaughtered by their own government.
This was ordinary men, women, and children, and the only reason that they were killed was because they were Tutsi.
After the killing started, General Dallaire requested more forces to stop the murders.
Within the first few days of the Rwandan war and genocide, Kofi Annan went to all 69 countries. Not one of them provided one soldier.
Although no nation would send troops to help the Rwandans, Western soldiers did arrive to evacuate Westerners.
And so all the expatriates, within 5 days, picked up what they had, left the Rwandans who had served them for years, decades, who raised their kids, left them to be slaughtered behind, and went back to Brussels and Paris and all these other places.
We have every reason to believe that acts of genocide have occurred.
How many acts of genocide does it take to make genocide?
There was, I think, just a collective willingness back in the United States and in all the world capitals to put your heads in the sand. And a lot of attention had turned to what to do about this massive refugee population of Hutus, among whom many of them were the killers or the political leaders who had orchestrated this campaign of violence. I must say that a lot of people were looking at this just horrific scene of death and misery going on in these refugee camps and thinking it was almost some type of retribution for what had gone on inside of Rwanda at the time. We keep telling ourselves that never again are we going to let this kind of a Holocaust happen. We said that after World War II. We said that after the Khmer Rouge genocide in Cambodia. We said it belatedly after Rwanda, but then we see it again in Darfur. And right now we're looking at what's happening in Syria. When there's something like a civil war, a man-made incident like this, I think there's really a reluctance to get involved and maybe even a willingness to put our heads back in the sand the same way we did with Rwanda, and it's going to be something that we end up regretting.
You just can't walk through all that blood and all that gore and all that sound. You got to start wondering about the depth of your belief in the moral values, the ethical values, and your belief in humanity. All humans are human. There are no humans more human than others. That's it.
Mark and Tali, all humans are human. There are no humans more human than others. Mark, if you can unmute yourself, please.
Yes, Howard.
And Mark, maybe I can just ask the first question and then I'll hand over to Tali. But 27 years ago today, tell us what happened.
27 years ago, a climax of what had been happening over the years happened. All the way from 1959, 1962, the 70s, like the entire preparation and training of people to hate one another to a point that Tony Bogusola said that he's going to prepare the apocalypse. 1994, all hell breaks loose, and what had been planned over the years and tested happens, and 1 million people die within 100 days. So on such a day, April 7th, they were killing people in large numbers from all over the country with a machine that had been prepared over the years. In 1993, there's a commission that was sent to Rwanda, and they said that what they have seen is ethnic cleansing and it's a genocide. But even that being said, it takes us back in 1965 when the New York Times published a document saying that there was a genocide happening in Rwanda, but nothing was done. So in 1994, it was the climax, the apocalypse, the primitive tools, the neighbor turning on neighbor, the radios calling on people to kill, the leaders, the president who replaced President Habyarimana on the second week of the genocide, goes out and tells people that you need to start working and you need to start killing, and then everything goes into motion and people start killing.
So Mark, you spoke about a buildup, of years after the colonial powers. Of course, for those that don't know, Rwanda, it was first a colony of Germany, then of Belgium, then it became independent. Can you speak a little bit about your family, what happened to your family in those years, and also speak about justice in those years between 1959 in 1994. Was there justice when there were massacres or when people were killed or persecuted?
So my story begins with my grandparents in 1959. They all suffered the atrocities just like the rest of the Tutsi population at that point in time. But for them, they didn't leave immediately. They left in 1961 because they're being persecuted in Western Rwanda in a place called Gisenyi, currently known as Rubavu. Now, when they went to the Congo, the issue was the anti-Tutsi sentiment had also gone on the other side of the border. Remember, they had wounds and they were terribly treated in this side of the border. But when they went on the other side, what happened was they also got arrested, beaten up again, to a point that that's where my grandfather dies. And now people move from Congo now, and then they take refuge again in Tanzania. So my life comes in Tanzania, and then I returned back in 1994. So returning back in 1994, I come from a clan called Abaganji, which is it's a big one, and lots of people have died in the family. But coming back, what we find is chaos. And, people have killed very many people. So, for example, I remember in 1994, I think I got back in Rwanda in August, which was like a few days after the genocide had stopped in Kigali, but not in the other parts of the country. And what was at hand and at stake at that point in time was, I remember the question was, what about justice? But I remember looking at people who are walking. Some of them, are traumatized. Some of them just didn't know where their beloved were. Some of them didn't know if they're going to see them again. If not, some of them had been raped, and now it's the time that they are free, but they're going with maybe pregnancy. Some of them thought they had killed and wiped up the family, but as they walk through the market, they see a survivor, and the survivor says, "Hey, I saw you, I remember you killed me, you did this to me," and through that chaos, maybe people come up, and then the police, we had the soldiers by then, they come take this person, take them to the commune, and there everyone is seeking for justice. Now, perpetrators, some have left Rwanda, have gone to Congo, just like the video showed you. But others are in Rwanda, hoping that no one will recognize them because they think that they have finished up everyone. And others are in Rwanda and truly they have finished up everyone, and no one is going to call them because even in their own community, no one is going to point a finger at them. So there we have a community that has those perpetrators, but we also have a community that has very many survivors and very many people who died in the process. So also we have a community that is made up of people who came from other parts of the world, who had been refugees and who had been denied to come back to Rwanda since 1959, and they had gone on fleeing different cases. So it's a mixture of all these people. So what about justice? I think that was the question that you asked.
Yes, maybe separate the justice between those years of massacres when your grandfather is killed, is his perpetrator comes to trial, and then what's happening to justice immediately in a destroyed country. You know, how do you start even that process of justice?
Yeah, sadly, nothing happened to them, to the perpetrators who committed atrocities in 1959, 1961, 1963, towards Christmas. As a matter of fact, there was a law that was enacted by the government of President Gregory Kayibanda in the Second Republic that protected perpetrators, mostly members of the Parmehutu party that carried out the killings in 1959. And this law was protecting them from being persecuted. And you can see the message was clear that the entire population was okay to go and kill Tutsis at that point in time. So during this time in 1959, there is really nothing that is happening. The people are given leeway because now the law has been enacted. If you committed those atrocities, you cannot be touched because you did the work that we wanted you to do. And fast forward in 1992, when the Parmehutis talking about their manifesto, they actually come up and say, remember what you did in 1999. That's the work we want you to do now. So it's a continuation of something that happened over the years, but unfortunately, the impunity was on and nothing happened in 1959. And thereafter,
Yeah, and I think that is important with the discussion that we had today. What happens when there is impunity, when you are not worried that you will be accused or come to justice? And that we have to recognize as a build-up to 1994. Mark, you described the marketplace and the places where perpetrators are moving around quite freely and because really 3/4 of the, if not more, of the Tutsi population was destroyed. A million Tutsi in a very, very small country, where and maybe even more were destroyed. Mark, who were the perpetrators? 1994. Just describe, just give us a picture of who are the perpetrators. What do we see in Rwanda after the genocide?
I can answer that. To a survivor, everyone was a perpetrator looking for them because they could hide nowhere. They could not go outside and run to their neighbor because their neighbor would turn on them. So the Hutu extremists here, what they wanted was to involve everyone so that no one will ever be persecuted. Just like I said, Theodore Sindikubwabo goes to a village, which in southern province in Rwanda, who had refused to carry out genocide. And he goes and tells them, you're supposed to do this, that even if you don't do it, then you'd also be killed. So there, what we see is that everyone is now involved in one way or another, and the entire, I'm not saying every Hutu got involved, but I'm saying that everyone was encouraged, and it was by courage that some of those who didn't get involved actually put themselves aside, and even some of them turned out to be rescuers. But at this point in time, we have radio stations that are calling out their names and where they live. We have lists that were made that people are going to be killed. We have leaders that are coming down to give weapons and to encourage people, as a matter of fact, to tell them that they will reward them if they kill these Tutsis. So at this point in time, the perpetrators, we have the masterminds, who are telling everyone to do it, but you also have the local guy who is your neighbor who because he heard that nothing will happen to them, they come and kill you. So it comes from the higher level to the military that was also involved. So the entire state apparatus was against this Tutsi population that was deemed to that they should be killed. So those are the perpetrators in a nutshell. But to a survivor, it feels like it's the whole world against them.
And it's beyond belief. I remember visiting Rwanda for the first time, I think 8 years after the genocide, and still it was like a devastated country, driving alone in a car, you know, no cars, and it took a long time. And Mark, very much like in the Holocaust, we spoke about the Nuremberg trials. The United Nations, of course, also put a tribunal that in Arusha called the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the ICTR, that took to court the masterminds. Maybe just very briefly speak about that. And then I think what we are more interested is about the perpetrators within Rwanda. And there were about 200,000 perpetrators that were arrested. So perhaps speak about both.
So the ICTR started in 1995. Of course, the world was looking for a solution, if I may say. But the biggest thing is that they didn't trust the courts in Rwanda. So they didn't think they would deliver justice. So the ICTR indicted 93 people in particular, and only sentenced 62 of them. Of course, acquitting 14 of them, and then the 10 others were referred to the national justice. And with that, we can see that there are some masterminds who are convicted. There are quite a number if I saw them, but I'll talk about two of them who are like the big shots. Think about Theoneste Bagosora, who got life in prison. He's the guy who prepared the apocalypse. He's the guy who told people to stay in their homes so that they can easily find them, because when the plane was shut down, there were already plans that these people should die. Had people started running away at that time, maybe some of them would have gotten saved, but they told them to stay in their homes, which made it easy to find them. So people like Theoneste Bagosora, who was a diehard hater of Tutsis, I don't know where he drank that from, I don't know where it comes from, but he was one of those who were convicted. Jean Kambanda was one of them, and actually he said he put it in practice, him and his cabinet, and he said it was a plan that was prepared before. And this is even to the people who are here on the platform, for them to know that actually the genocide against the Tutsi did not happen by the spark of the plane, but it's something that was planned before time, and it was executed with the government apparatus systematically making sure that they wipe out an entire population. So that being said, there are many fugitives that are still running out there. Recently, they caught Felicien Kabuga on May 16th, I guess, last year, and he had been on the run for over 26 years. You talked about these people who are of age. He's come of age, but of course he should face justice so that this culture of impunity is eradicated. We have people like Fulgence Kayishema, Aloys Ndimbati, Phineas Mierugarama, and we also have those whom we know where they are. For example, Kano Seruga, who is currently in France, and many, many more. Right? Yeah. And to speak about that still, there are 1,145 indictments that the Rwandan government put out and spread around the world. And in all those, some of them are in Africa, some of them are in South Africa, I'm sorry to say. Yes. Some of them are in America, some of them are all over the world. And all these people haven't been arrested to be brought to justice. But even if they don't bring them to Rwanda, they haven't even taken them to courts to make sure that they face justice. And these are the people who are running different countries. Yeah. So,
Mark, maybe yeah. I'll just disturb for a second that just to tell our audience that there is a very high award. Yeah, award for the top, the top genocidaires, as we call them, those top wanted. And the State Department of the United States is offering $5 million for anyone that can give details about any one of those on the wanted list. For example, Felician Kabuga, that you spoke about, that was captured last year in France, he was in Africa. He lived in Africa like a king, like a very, very rich king, and also in France. And he was behind buying the machetes, thousands and thousands of machetes, was behind hate radio RTLM. So this is a big, big fish. Mark, maybe speak though about within Rwanda. You chose the route of restorative justice. If we from South Africa, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You chose the route of Gacaca. Can you speak a little bit about what is Gacaca? Why did you choose it? And just tell us about it, because it's very inspirational, I think, for all of us, that story.
Yeah, after the genocide, after killing 1 million people in 100 days, I remember the gentleman who was breaking the numbers down. You can imagine if people are using machetes, these are not gas chambers that you put in 300-400 people to die at once. These are individuals involved in hunting and all doing these things. So the numbers were really, really large. And if Rwanda had chosen to go the conventional way of using the normal courts, what would have happened is we would have taken years, and justice delayed is justice denied, and it would have been difficult, and it would have continued with the genocidaires' reason, which they want to involve everyone. But that being said, when the genocide happened, there was what they call the Rugwiro talks, and people are looking for a solution. How do we make sure that we come up with a solution that will bring these people to justice? So they come up with Gacaca courts. The Gacaca courts divided people in two categories. There are masterminds and the people who are leading, who would go to the conventional courts, but there are also these other guys who are just following, who would go to Gacaca courts. Now, the pathway for this was, how do we get the truth from the people? How do we know the numbers? How do we know who are the victims? How do we know who are the perpetrators and all these things? So the Gacaca courts started by going down, looking going down to look for information, which people lived here, and then they went door by door to find all this information. But after they found the information, they made sure that they bring people, and then they start the process. Now, I won't go much into the process, but the whole reason was to have a restorative justice so that people can have the truth, and that truth to know where are their beloved. Was it attained 100%? No, it wasn't. But it is the load of over 1.2 million cases that wouldn't have seen justice if they went to the normal courts. But also, there was truth that was found out. One, there are perpetrators who are living amongst us that we did not know. As a matter of fact, one of my childhood friends had his bigger brother who in Nyamirambo who had seen his dad commit atrocities. And, he was a well-respected man walking in the streets, and there was no one who had seen him other than his son. So when Gacaca started, I remember I was just a high school kid. Middle school kid. I went to some of those, and I found this young man saying what happened that his father did during the genocide that no one else had seen. Another example is also a family friend married to a Tutsi woman. He was on a roadblock, and there are people who had seen him and had been with him, and they pointed him out. And we did not know that, because there is a story we had, but had it not been for Gacaca, wouldn't have known these people. But also the truth, how many people were thrown where, by who, how did they die? Can we get them from there and we bury them in dignity? Of course, there are some survivors at the moment who haven't found their beloved for various reasons, but some of that is truth suppression. But at least it showed some of that, and it pulled out a lot. Of course, there are places where there will be no information because everyone was killed. And because everyone was killed, there is no one to say the information and people can keep it to themselves. But it happened and it brought people together. And for most of the people, at least it started the journey of unity and reconciliation. And people are on different phases and different levels, but at least the journey started, and people now, some of them have gone a step farther than they were in 1994.
Thank you so much, Mark, because I mean, this story of restorative justice, and for those of you that do not know, the death penalty is not allowed in Rwanda. The Gacaca processed, as you said, 1.2 million cases. If normal courts would do that, it will take maybe 100 years or more. So this process did help to rebuild a very destroyed country. I really thank you for sharing with us some of those processes. Howard, from you?
So I think there's so many in South Africa who need to learn the lessons of Rwanda. Mark, if we come visit you in Kigali, tell us where we find you. What is there, a museum, a center? Where can we visit you there and learn more about the entire genocide and learn about the justice process?
So I work from the Kigali Genocide Memorial, also for Aegis Trust. The center can be visited, even now during the pandemic. It can be visited. Of course, there are measures put in place for people to follow so that they don't get sick when they get at the memorial. But we have various programs, and in these programs, we go in details and in depth from how were genocides prepared, which we call the continuum of violence, which actually was started by Arvin Staub. And then we go deeper in details in the history of Rwanda, and then we also learn how about other places so that people can see the processes to know this is the genocide against the Tutsi and this is how it happened. Historically, this is how it happened, its effects, and how it goes forward. But also, our programs have been taken into the national curriculum where we train people, be it in schools, all the way from primary school to universities. And then we have some for teachers who are in pre-service, these are students, but also those who are in service, where we create content for them that they can use to learn about the genocide, but above all, to learn about the positive values, which maybe I can talk about 3 of them, which would be critical thinking, empathy, and personal responsibility. And the reason for this is when we hear about people who committed atrocities, one of the things that they talk about is they told me to do and I did, which means they did not think on their own. And one of the things that Tali said is that some of those, when they are released, they don't go back and commit crimes because now they have learned. So one of the best ways to prevent that from happening is having a population that is critically thinking, so that when they make decisions, they know they're also going to be responsible for them. But also considering that all humans are human, just like you asked us when we started, by having empathy towards the other. So that way, when they have empathy towards the other, it makes it easier for them to know that if I can hurt, he can also hurt. So I should not, harm him in any way. So if you come at the memorial, this is what you're going to learn. You're going to learn about the history of the genocide against the Tutsi. You're going to learn about the history of Rwanda. Of course, you'll find the Holocaust also in the museum and other mass atrocities that happened elsewhere. But
Mark, is there a website we can visit?
Yes, I can link it up in the chat.
If you could put it in the chat, that would be amazing. Tali, also for those people in South Africa, you run the Holocaust and Genocide Center in Johannesburg. It covers both the Holocaust and the genocide against the Tutsis in Rwanda. Are you open? Are people visiting at the moment?
Absolutely. We are open since the 1st of September, and we will welcome anyone. Make an appointment that we will make sure that you have a guide that can take you around, but it's very safe. As Mark said, all museums are extremely safe, COVID-friendly, and please do come and visit the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, but also our sister centers in Cape Town and in Durban, the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center and the Durban Holocaust and Genocide Center. We're all part of an association, a national association, the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation.
Let us also remind everyone that on Friday, 12 o'clock South African time, is our communal commemoration of the Holocaust, Yom HaShoah. So please participate by joining the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, their YouTube page as well, or YouTube channel, as well as their page on Facebook, and join us in commemorating the survival of our people, but more importantly, making sure that we never forget the memory of the 6 million Jews who were murdered by the Nazis in the Second World War. With that, I would like to thank everyone for joining us this evening. We'd really appreciate it if you just took a moment and left a comment for all of our panelists. So whether you're watching on Zoom, on YouTube, or on Facebook, we'd just appreciate it if you could leave us one last comment for this evening. And we're going to play out with two things. Number one, just a reminder that the South African Jewish Report has been bringing you your stories for the last 23 years. And we survive because of you, our audience, and we certainly need your help. So we're going to be telling you over the next few weeks how you can help us in order to make sure both the newspaper, the webinars, as well as things like the newsletters, all continue to survive and thrive over this period of time, particularly during the crunch of COVID. But we'll see you tomorrow evening. 8 o'clock tomorrow, we're going to be talking about the South African vaccine rollout, as well as the lessons that we've learned from Israel's vaccine rollout, as it has led the world really in an amazing process to make sure that the entire country has been vaccinated. In fact, more than 82% of every eligible person in Israel has received 2 doses of a vaccine. So we're going to be discussing that tomorrow at 8 o'clock, as well as giving you practical, real advice on how you can register, where you can go, when you should expect to receive a vaccine, if you're 70 years old, if you're 60 years old, if you're young and healthy, what do the timelines actually look like? And so we have the most relevant people in the country helping us answer those questions tomorrow. So thank you for joining us this evening. We'll see you tomorrow. Tali, thank you so much for partnering with us and putting tonight together. Really appreciate and value the relationship that we have together.
Thank you very much, Howard. And good night, good day to everyone that joined us. And thank you.